Hi everyone, welcome to episode 332 of the Adelaide Show podcast. I'm Steve Davis. We're going to paint pictures of South Australia orally in this episode with Alex Frayne, a magnificent landscape photographer. He's going to take us into his art. Also, we're having a taste of Ginache, which is gin blended with Grenache, and it's from Never Never Distilling Company. Look, that tasting, which we kick off with in just a moment, it does include perhaps a slightly higher concentration of innuendo than normally is the case. Just to be forewarned is to be prepared. So that's coming up in just a moment. Sean Baxter, don't blame him. I just think we ended up recording this at a time when we were both being able to let our hair down just a smidgen. And it's beautiful. Oh my goodness. If you haven't tried this Ginache, get a bottle before it disappears. In the musical pilgrimage, I was on Hamilton Island last week at the time of recording, and I met a gentleman. His name is Tim Seeley. He's a bass player. He's in a band called Magic Tortoise Band. They're going to take us out with a track tonight. So lots coming up. It's going to be an interesting show. Something, firstly, to feed your hedonistic needs with this Ginache, and then we're going to the high arts with photography before we mellow out with some alt folk. I don't know how else to describe it. It's going to be interesting music to finish off the show. Enjoy. And I should mention, we have chapter headings. So if you open up your app player right now, there should be an option to jump from chapter to chapter. So if you want to skip the tasting, you can go straight to the chat about photography. But, you never know. You never know unless you try.
Wave on waves since the gun-up bedroom. Adelaide, who landed here and made it their home. Adelaide, who 10-pound bombs to the refugees. Adelaide, who brings it dead and soon to knees. Adelaide, who oh, little Adelaide, oh, Adelaide, who oh, little Adelaide, who.
In the spirit of reconciliation, the Adelaide Show podcast acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout South Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today.
Adelaide, Adelaide, Adelaide.
This episode is going to be so delicious as a snapshot of South Australia. We've got some photography coming up. We've got some new music coming up. But first cab off the rank is gin with a twist. Sean Baxter from Never Never Distilling is going to take us through a tasting. Welcome to the Adelaide Show, Sean.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
Now, for those people watching the video of this, you're just sitting, on a post in the middle of your paddock, aren't you?
Oh, it's the wonders of modern technology now, Steve. We can be wherever we want. And right now I am currently situated smack dab in the middle of the Chalk Hill Vineyard. Looking behind me, you'll see our wonderful distillery, complete with its wonderful Never Never doors. But yes, it's wonderful what Zoom can do these days.
It is, isn't it? And I just imagine Alex Frayne getting there with his camera and taking some beautiful shots too. That might happen in the future.
It's a great spot for some photography, that's for sure.
Now, before we start proper, if you've got just a glass of something near you at the moment, this is going to be a virtual toast because we like to toast our late patron Queen Adelaide to begin with. So, to the Queen. All right, our duty is done. And now, the queen of this tasting for the South Australian Drink of the Week is something I've got. I'm just going to hold up to the camera. Look at this. By the way, I've got to say, your packaging at Never Never Distilling Company is without peer. It's magnificent.
Well, thank you very much. We put a lot of effort into it, to be honest. It's one of those it's one of the, I guess the lessons we learnt early days is that appearance is important, and often the very first interaction people have with your product is very fleeting. So you'd want it to be memorable, and we like to think that our packaging is quite beautiful.
Yes. Well, this is what we're going to be tasting today. Let me just hold that up. This is your Ginache, which now let me see if I've done my homework correctly. 2020 was when you released the world first Ginache, and we'll explain what that is in a minute. And this is the 2021 edition. You got some more Grenache grapes from local McLaren Vale vineyards. What does Ginache mean?
Well, I'm glad you asked it, because it's one of my favourite words. I like a pun. I'm an ex-bartender. Most ex-bartenders like a pun. And what you'll find is it's the combination of the word gin and the combination of the word Grenache. So what you've got in there is Grenache fruit that has been picked, destemmed and crushed, and then that is being used in the gin production process to create colour and sweetness, which is where you get that wonderful play Ginache.
So I also give it the dad joke blessing as well.
Well, I'm a new dad, so I'm glad that that really did influence my decision making in the name. Funnily enough, it was a bit of a joke name that we had said all the way through the production process. We'll change it when we get to the end.
Yep.
And then by the end of that production process, it got to the serious bit, and we were all so enamoured with Ginache that it stayed. So I was quite happy.
All right, well, that's good. Now, what we're going to do now is a bit of a tasting, which we're doing virtually at either ends of Adelaide. And so I'm just going to switch the camera view here, at my end at least, so that when whoever's talking will dominate the screen so that we can get to see everything. So let me show you what I've got. Can I get my equipment out for you?
Absolutely. That was. It usually takes the gin to get that sentence out, mate. But I'm glad that we can get there straight away.
Okay, so I have a brand new bottle of your Ginache. I also have a Fever Tree tonic water, which I'm told is one that you bless.
Yes, we do love the old Fever Tree.
Okay. I have a big ball of ice for my glass.
Wow, that's just showing off now.
Okay.
That's wonderful.
And I have a sachet of your dehydrated garnish. In this case, it looks like they're orange peel, slices of orange.
That's fantastic. That would work wonderfully.
Now, the other thing is that I have here, you will appreciate this as a former barman. As I was looking, because we're just going to do something really basic today, because that's what I've got to work with. I normally pour by sight, but I thought, with your pedigree, I better do the right thing. I've got a double jigger.
Oh, well, this is important. It's one of my hacks for the home bartender.
Yep.
Always measure.
Yep.
If anything COVID has taught me is never trust your eye line on a Tuesday after a huge day of homeschooling, that 30 mils may progress into a quick 100 mils very rapidly. So, so measuring is important.
So the first question then, for us people doing this at home, which glass? I've got two different glasses. I've got more or less your straight sort of tumbler, nice and flat, and I've got my bigger wine glass. That's really what I've got to play with.
Well, I think they both hold liquid, so they're both already a great start.
Okay.
I prefer to go with the wine glass with this particular option because there's actually quite a lot of aromatics, and a wine glass, you're more used to kind of getting your nose in there. Yep. You can still do it in a normal rocks glass, of course. I've actually got a rocks glass here, which I'll be using. But if I've got the option of a wine glass, I reckon I'd go with that because that's it's going to be very well suited.
Beautiful. Okay, so I've got that now, and I'm now in your hands. You guide me through.
Well, shall we do a quick tasting first? So pour a little splash into your wine glass before we add any ice or any mixer.
Oh, that's a good idea. Okay.
You can just have a little splash. You could do this by sight.
Yep.
And what we're going to look for is, I guess, some of those unique flavours and characteristics that really separate this from other products in the market.
All right.
One thing that I love about our Ginache is the way that it's made. So the way that we actually create it is that we take a Ginache fruit that's been pressed, as I mentioned earlier, and then we use that as the dilutive element. There we go. That's perfect there.
Okay.
We use that as the dilutive element in our gin production run. So rather than diluting with water, the gin comes off the still at around 80% ABV, so quite high. Usually dilute that down to about 43% using water. Rather than using water, we use this wonderful Grenache fruit and juice. So what you end up with is this really rich style of gin that comes with it all the natural sugars that is attached to, I guess, Grenache fruit itself, but also all the wonderful flavour that's associated with it.
That's masterful. That's masterful.
It's really quite fun, and what you're also doing is you're amplifying flavour through it every single step. On the nose, you should get this sort of like tinned plum that's got this real wonderful sort of bright red fruit characteristic, this quite, I guess, fresh raspberries.
Yep. And if I remember as a youngster opening up a tin of fruit, the old golden circle tins, there's like it's not a tin, but it's a sparkling, a sparkle to the aroma that's coming with it.
It captures a lot of it, we use that kind of cork. Obviously, you're doing that same thing. You're capturing that character and you're capturing that flavour. Again, that's why I recommend drinking it rather quickly, because, again, once you let it out, it doesn't take long for it to change, which is very similar to a lot of your fruit-based gins and products.
I'm getting the hint. I'm getting the hint then. Are you saying I should get some in my palate?
Rapidly.
Okay.
Have a little taste. And the good thing about it is very approachable. The one thing that we find with a lot of people who try it is that they can't get their head around the fact that this is still a product that's up there at 38%. It's very, very welcoming on the palate. It's very, very gentle. It's quite silky. It's got a real luxury to it. And the carry-through still continues for quite some time. So you're getting wonderful fruit character up front, and then it finishes off with all that spice. Now, Grenache itself is a really spicy style of varietal that's got everything from cinnamon to dark earthen characteristics. So when you combine that with actual botanicals like cinnamon and pepperberry, you get this wonderful play on flavour. For me, it's an absolute cracker. It works so well, even neat, but now we're going to mix it with some different things and you'll find out how versatile it is.
Oh, look, just the way I would describe what I just experienced then is if you imagine, those movies from America where they're set in the 70s with those big Cadillacs, big long Cadillacs.
Oh, yeah, I'm picking up what you're putting down. This is good.
Lots of chrome. And so when the first arrival in the mouth is all those, not so much sharp, but there's this fireworks of all those typical gin, botanical spirit that you normally get. And that's that flashy chrome as it comes into sight. And then the camera, Martin Scorsese is the director, he cuts to the interior. And there in the interior, here I am in my big mink coat, and the car's suspension just goes boom, nice. And it sinks, and it's just, and this soft suspension of fruit. The wine, the Grenache, starts coming to the fore for me, that sort of fruity, winey flavour, and nice. And then, you're dead right, we cut back, and there's the tail lights as it's going into the future, way off, and you can see them well down the freeway as it sort of zooms away from you, and it's one long, smooth ride.
Holy moly, Steve. I don't know what, do you want a job? Because that's probably the most elegant and most sophisticated description of any spirit that I've ever heard, let alone ours. Thank you very much. I'm glad it was it made such an impact. We're very proud of it. I think it's a cracking representation of a South Australian blend of gin and a local varietal.
Yeah, no, I love it. So that's the starters. What are we going to do with this now?
Well, the beautiful thing about it is because there's so much accessible sugar and flavour that you can find in here. There's so many ways that you can stretch it. It's all natural, of course, so you can really play around with it in a variety of different ways. Mm-hmm. One of my favourite ways of I guess, constructing a drink is to play around with it in a gin and tonic. Now, of course, most gins should go with tonic water. The one good thing about Fever Tree that I really enjoy, there's lots of things I enjoy about Fever Tree, but one of the most important ones is that it uses real flavour. It uses real quinine, which is important when you're mixing it with juniper character, which is still found, even though this gin is largely fruit forward, there's still juniper character there. So combining both of them should be a wonderful symphony of flavour, and that's what you're able to achieve through combining alpha-pinene, which is the major flavour in juniper, and also quinine, which is the major flavour in tonic water.
All right.
So those are my two preferences. Now, I like to Like you're gonna show me up now, Steve, because after all that chat about a jigger, I don't reckon I've got one. But of course, I'm very well trained. I know exactly what I'm doing here.
Have you got your service of alcohol badge on at the moment?
It is. It's actually hanging up on the wall just behind me. You won't be able to see it. I should say vineyard. It's over the vineyard over there, slightly.
All right.
Now, what I like to sort of always recommend is that you work with 30 mils of your Grenache, I should say.
Okay.
30 mils is basically your standard drink, and that's the beautiful thing about that measurement. You're always going to be guaranteed a standard. So you've got that looks like your 30 mils there.
Yes.
I'm pretty sure that's your 30 mils at the top and 15 mils at the bottom.
Perfect.
So you can pour your 30 mils out there.
Right.
And if you don't have one of those at home, ladies and gentlemen, a standard egg cup is usually around about 30 mils, and that's where we get the actual beginnings, if you like, of a jigger. It used to be that measurement, that egg cup measurement. So it's at least an American ounce, which is very close. So
okay. Now, just before I pour that into the glass, should I dip my bowl into the glass first, the ice ball, or does that go last?
The ice ball is an interesting one because it does have less. It dilutes less. So I would actually, just because it's a bit awkward, I wouldn't want to drop it in and it can splash everywhere. You don't have the right kind of tong. I would just drop it in there and just pour gently over the top. Okay,
so let me just get my ball out. This is not typical Adelaide show content.
Well, look, I'm already very excited by the detail of the ice. Ice is important.
Here we go.
You know, it's always important to add. This is going to be great too. In that wine glass. Look at this. Look at this. Oh, you are showing me up. Look at this. That is absolutely spectacular.
So now I'll get my jigger out, and one of my jiggers, because I've got two here, and I'll just pour 30 mil. 30 mils right over the top of that ice. Right.
I'll put mine over here. You can see that. That's lovely.
Yep. Hang on. And now let's get this up. Whoa. Just to pour it in.
Look at that. Like a pro, seasoned professional.
Okay. All right. So what do I do next?
Now, the next one, the easy thing about your fever tree is that we call for 100 mils, which is exactly about half of this bottle. So it's basically down to where the label starts on the bottle. So you basically just want to pour out half of that.
Okay. Now, this is where I need to have one more confession.
There we are.
After all the other innuendo-laden things, this is my bottle opener.
My goodness, Steve. This is progressed. It's progressed beyond.
It's come.
The innuendo. We just gone flat out now. You have a penis. For listeners, maybe has a penis-shaped bottle opener.
And look, it's not mine. It was given to me. I received this.
Well, even more information than we need, Steve.
From my nephew and his wife, who are a good Christian couple who went to Indonesia and came back with one for me. All right. Hang on.
It's where is it? Which end is the bit that you're using there, Steve?
Oh, the other end, the business end, not the business end. Yes.
Okay, that would have made my eyes water, I think.
Here we go. All right, so I've got it off. Hang on. Poor choice of words. Now, again, just don't measure with my jigger. Just go to the label.
I don't think you need to. Like you can see, just pour it down to where the sticker is at the top. That's about 100 mils. So keep on pouring until you get down to that point, and that's it, perfect. And that is your half glass of your 100 mils of tonic.
Yep.
And that is your standard sort of pour. Now, again, it sits I think quite comfortably in that glass with that wonderful piece. Now, again, you can take your garnish out now, Steve. You've picked up that packet. Okay. I would just go with that wonderful piece of orange.
Okay.
Pop it in the top, and you're going to get some wonderful sort of dried citrus characteristic off the nose too, which is going to work beautifully with the plummy, I guess, bright sort of citrus characters that can be found not only in the Grenache but also in the tonic itself. Wonderful.
Oh, that smells it. So just drop that in.
Drop that in. Couldn't be easier. Or it might be too big. What you might have to do is just give it a nice split in half. That's the wonderful thing about dehydrated fruit. You'll be able to break that in half pretty easily. Just give that a little snap, and it should break up.
And to put
wonderful. Look at that.
Put both halves in, or just one? Huh.
I reckon just the one will be fine.
Okay.
Yeah, pop that down the side. Wonderful. And you get a little bit of that on the nose. And now let's have a little sample.
Okay.
It's lovely. So what
Yeah.
you'll find now is that because you've added that effervescence and because there's actually citrus character in the tonic water, what you've actually got there is the Indian fever tree. And what that actually has is a lot of orange bitter oil, Mexican orange bitter oil. It's going to work really well, not only with the garnish selection, which is that dehydrated piece of orange, but also in the gin itself, you're going to find all this wonderful citrus, so lemon and also lime that's used in that process. Orange is a happy bedfellow, so it works really well in that combination.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as you combine that wonderful Grenache fruit, you're opening up a whole range of different flavors. So it is a really fun, very, very simple cocktail in a bottle, really. You open yourself up to so many different flavors and so many different aromas.
Yes, and this is now no longer in the Cadillac, though. This is much harder, this experience, in an interesting way. It's like, imagine this is probably, the bad guy or the good guy now is hopping in out of the Cadillac. They've jumped into a speedboat and they are shooting and sort of banging hard against that ocean. And that's so the different flavours, slightly different flavours, they're whizzing past me much faster than before. And because of that orange, there's a tannic bitter, like the bitterness I'm getting through, which is drying the palate a bit. And so you think it's going to dry, and then just like that speedboat, it's banging us in the air, and now it's gone. There was this initial wash that was drying out, and now it's like back and forth, and so off we go into the sunset.
And I think what you're describing is a classic aperitif, and that's beautifully what tonic water does. It dries out, it opens the palate up, and it gets the palate ready for more. So it actually makes you salivate. So as you're drinking classic aperitifs, gin and tonic's a great example of a classic aperitif.
Yep.
So was beer. So was a really dry beer. So was a really dry white wine. They allow you to feel, you salivate for more.
Yep.
As soon as you have a sip of it, it dries out quite quickly, and then your palate begins to salivate. You dive back in again, and I think that's the wonderful thing about really great aperitifs. And the Grenache for mine is a great one.
No, thank you. This is an eye-opener and a palate-opener for me. My mates at Big Shed Brewing, Jason and Craig, they've swung me a bit more to the beer side, which I always just...
Well, our history with Big Shed, we started off in the back of their shed. So we started off in Big Shed's shed in Royal Park back in 2017. 16 square metres with Jason Craig. They were very happy taste testers, I should let you know.
They're very generous that way, very generous.
They were always sniffing about. They loved to just dedicate their time, especially Craig, always dedicated his time to getting to know our gin explicitly well. And we have a vast success to thank those two for.
Yep.
So I wanted to make mention of that. They're wonderful, wonderful fellows.
Well, they tipped me a bit more to the beer side because I've always been just a whiskey and a wine drinker. And now you've tipped me back to the gin side. So, this is really interesting. And I love, because you've brought two of my worlds together. You've brought wine and you've brought gin in one. And John from Chaos Spirit, he also was on our show many, many years ago in the early days. He started the journey, but I think you've just finished me off, so to speak.
Oh, well,
Sean Baxter.
With all the innuendo, Steve, I'm glad that we could get to that particular point in the conversation, because it wouldn't have been right to have left it without that.
No, to left it hanging.
To have finished you off is by means of just... It makes me happy to be able to say Never Never has had that claim. So I appreciate that sentiment very much, mate.
Where is the easiest way for people to buy your Grenache? Because I know it's fairly rare, so if you're going to do this, you've got to do it bloody quickly.
It is. We don't have a huge amount, and it is landing on shelf in some of your local national retailers shortly. But there isn't a huge amount of it, so it won't be there for very long. So your local independents here in Adelaide, please go and support them. There's lots of them around. We all know which ones we're talking about. It's on shelf at Facina. It's on shelf at a range of the local BWS as well, and of course Dan Murphy's. But come and visit us up at the hill where I'm currently situated, of course.
Yes, of course.
It would be great for you to come and check out the amazing space. And, of course, there isn't anything better than drinking this wonderful Grenache-inspired gin whilst staring over the vines themselves. It's a wonderful part of South Australia. So come up and check us out and grab a bottle from the hill. One
last note, that you released this new version of Grenache on World Gin Day, which was June 12, which is my birthday.
well, this is where the planets have aligned.
Yeah.
And it's clear that there is a message that is being sent down to you on high about the shifting dynamic of you away from beer and whiskey towards gin. And, you know, again, you shouldn't let the final words of Dean Martin ring in your ear, which was, I should never have quit whiskey for martinis. But that, you know what, it's just one guy, all right? Let's just keep on pursuing as many martinis and as many wonderful gin and tonics as you can muster.
Well, my middle name was named and inspired by Dean Martin, so...
Well, this is it. I don't understand what we're doing here. Like, there's too many weird things going on in one interview, mate, I have to admit.
Okay, well, when the moon's in the sky, let's drink some gin. Sean Baxter from... I lost my track there. Never Never Distilling Company. Gin Ash is the South Australian drink of the week. SA Tourism Commission's CEO, Rodney Harricks.
Look, while you're out and about listening to the Adelaide Show, have a think about what you can do to support regional South Australia. Get onto southaustralia.com and look for something new and different you haven't done before to experience with your family or friends.
In the foreword to Landscapes of South Australia, Murray Bramwell notes that a landscape is a scene from a single aspect. He notes that Alex Frame helps us see, almost for the first time, what it is that has been seen many times before. It's an act of revelation. And my hope is this interview will shed some light on local photographer and artist Alex Frame, so that those of us who have seen his work can have the artist revealed. Welcome to the Adelaide Show podcast, Alex Frame.
It's great to be here, Steve. Thank you for having me on the show.
Yes. Now, before we get in deep, I just want to share a perpetual love, or a mutual love you and I both have, for inhaling chemicals. And by that I mean, well, I grew up, my dad had a dark room which was next to my bedroom, and he and I used to shoot black and white film and develop it, and it was just joyful. Do you still dabble in the art of chemicals?
I do, in so much as developing the roles of film myself. I don't darkroom print simply because the technology in the industrial and commercial printing realm is so advanced compared to 25, 30 years ago. But I shoot lots of film. I'm not a film Nazi. I do shoot some digital.
I do know, because looking through your book, you have confessed on some of them that it was digital SLR. I thought, my goodness.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes digital is better than film. I think particularly for really low light shooting, and especially at night, digital has the edge. But I think film is what I grew up with. Film is what I learnt. Film, indeed, is what films were shot on right up until about 2004 or 5. So I think, I don't think that it's an essential part of. I don't preach film as being the only way, but it's just the tool, I guess, that I'm most comfortable with. I talk to students and I say, when you go to someone's house for dinner, you don't sort of say, well, what was the oven that we used to bake that cake? What oven was that? So you can see my point is that, whatever medium someone is happy to use and whatever medium gives full voice to their expression, that is the medium for them. And it just happens that film is my format.
I should check if my dad concurs with that, because in a similar analogy, he was also a carpenter, a builder growing up, and so would have learned with a hammer, but then nail guns came into fore during his time. So the nail is still wedged in the wood.
Yeah, indeed. It's still there. It's just a different way of getting it there.
Anyway, I've splintered our conversation already. Let's get back to what I'd planned, because there's a really big theme I'd like to start with, and it's about, the discipline of seeing the familiar and seeing in inverted commas, and perhaps to give us some focus to this conversation, one of the stills in your book, Landscapes of South Australia, is called Maslin Beach. And I think it's a good start for undressing this topic, as it were, because I've just come back from there, and you're...
Really?
So get used to this.
Which end of Maslins are we talking? North or south?
No, I was fully clad.
Go on.
Yeah. I've got pictures to prove it. So what you've captured there is this lovely autumnal palette, which I want to come back to later. But you see this landscape, and it's breathtaking, the sort of thing you see in a brochure that makes you want to hop on a plane and go somewhere when you can. You've got this coastline in its full morning glory, if you wish, with some water, some green vegetation. It's absolutely lavish. It's right under our noses. What makes you stop to shoot something that many of us, South Aussies in particular, just drive past and take for granted? Can you take us into that thought process?
The first thing is, I guess, is the discipline aspect you mentioned, the ability to see a frame and to compose that frame in one's mind, and then the next stage of actually pulling out a camera and shooting that frame. That discipline is honed over many years of being a photographer, an artist, or a filmmaker in my early days. The composition side of photography is really interesting because you can give two cameras to two different people and they'll compose the same shot of a bowl of fruit completely differently. One will tend to be better than the other, or not. But composition is something which takes practice, years of practice. I liken it to golf, because I play golf, and the absolute need to continue to hone that muscle memory of a swing. When becoming a photographer, you start to become aware that you are honing that visual memory, the crystallized visual memory, the ability to see groupings, to see shapes, to divide the frame into rules of thirds, or so, these kind of tropes go way back. I think as I get better at the art, I become more adept at finding frames. So when I saw that particular frame that you're referencing at Maslins Beach, I knew I had to shoot it. That's the compositional side of it, the urge to have to put it into celluloid, that thing that you've seen in your mind. But the second thing is there has to be an emotional resonance to actually force me to get the camera out. I have to feel that compulsion. And I guess with Maslins, there's a kind of memory, a cultural memory I have of the place, which of course is to do with the fact that it was the first unclad beach in Australia. The second one was actually Pelican Point at Barmera. Not many people know that. But I guess Maslins, I approached Maslins from the South car park, which is the nudist entry point. And whenever I've been to that car park, I've been aware that you never see people. I never see people from that landing that looks down onto the beach, because actually you have to go further down to actually see where people are. When I took that shot, there was nobody around. As I went further down to the beach, I started to be aware of people, and they saw that I had a camera, and they suddenly disappeared in all directions. So there were people there. They were, indulging in nudist sunbaking. There's a melancholic feel to Maslins Beach. Now, that car park has been the scene of several murders over decades.
I didn't know about that.
Recently, actually, yeah. Right. In the last year or three. It's surveilled with cameras everywhere, that car park. It has a strange feel about it. That kind of strangeness, that weirdness, that melancholy is grist for my mill. I mean, that is the juice for me.
Is that melancholy intrinsic to the place, or does it require an awareness of that historical context?
I think that melancholy resonates, and there's a residue that is built up over decades, or hundreds of years, or indeed thousands of years, if we're talking about Indigenous history. I think my job as an artist, as a photographer, is to imbue the image with that melancholy. That is what I have to bring. That is my role. That is my calling, is to be aware of these feelings and to actually make them real through a photograph. That is the job of the photographer. And if you can do that successfully, it doesn't have to be melancholia we're talking about. It could be joy. It could be ancient. It could be something that's shimmering and beautiful and joyous. I mean, we're just choosing melancholia because that's the feeling I felt at that landing, at that car park. But if you can do that, if you can convert an abstract concept into a real photograph, you feel that you're actually creating art.
Just in case anyone's curious, were you nude when you took the photograph at Mass?
No, I was... I mean, that's something that no one would like to see. But I was aware there were some nude people running in different directions when they saw that I had a camera and a tripod. I mean, wow. They were disappearing and going behind this and that and the other and heading off one direction.
Right.
Yeah.
If it was me, I would have just asked to make sure you sent a copy to my...
You would have had a card to give out to me.
That's right. But I think you just touched on something that helps me understand this. There are certain places around Adelaide that are familiar to me, but they trigger a memory of a time. It could be a scent, reminds me of something. Is that the thing that gives you pause to stop and actually look with your photographer's eyes or your artist's eyes at something that might be otherwise mundane?
That is the thing that pulls me in. Okay. That is the only thing that there is. Because if there isn't that, you're just taking pictures randomly and you're just pointing your camera hither and thither and hoping that you're going to get something nice. It's not like that at all for me. There has to be that underlying cultural feeling. Now, if it was just that, if it was just a cultural memory, a meme that was passed down and then photographed by me and only understood by South Australians, I would find that limiting. It has to resonate beyond South Australia. It has to resonate to a curator in Queensland, a collector in Darwin, an ex-Adelaide person living in Hobart. It doesn't have to be resonant just for South Australians. It has to be resonant for a human being.
Yeah. And I would argue we've come of age now, I think, South Aussies here in Adelaide, and certainly when this podcast began in 2013, it was called Another Boring Thursday Night at Adelaide.
Which is a reference to a Red Gum tune.
Absolutely.
Great tune.
And it was our fight against Adelaide being dismissed as boring because you could be bored out of your head in New York City if you wish to. And so we fought that. And there was a lack of self-confidence in many South Australians. You're focusing this art with a universal eye. Was there something in you that ever that ever wondered if, am I choosing the right subject? Will I ever be taken seriously, given that there are artists who base themselves in New York and just work in that space and others in the laneways of country England and building their name?
One thing I never worry about or care about in my life is other artists. Okay. I don't worry that someone in New York might be experiencing more volumes of people to photograph. I don't worry that in Europe there are vast landscapes that I would love to explore. I worry about what's here and what's available, and especially in COVID time, what's possible. Make the best of your surroundings. Now, I've travelled around the world. I've been to pretty much every continent, and I approach those places in the same way that I approach here in Adelaide. I just have a camera, and if I'm emotionally resonating with a place, I'll want to photograph it.
But you have thrown your lot with Adelaide and South Australia with much of your photography career.
Yes.
And I just wonder, that takes some sort of professional courage because you could be sneered at by art collectors and buyers in Sydney looking down their noses at you.
They do.
They do.
Oh, I mean, that happens all the time, and I laugh at it. I think it's just part of the fun of it all, you know, this interstate rivalry. I mean, what you'll see is that at festival time, Mad March, you'll get people from the eastern states coming over here and approaching me and talking about photography. And one of the first questions that will be asked is, why aren't you in Melbourne or Sydney? And it's one of those questions that's it's a tough one, because it's sort of like saying, well, why aren't you in... It's like someone saying to me, Alex, why don't you go and live in Mongolia? Because the steppes over there are great to photograph. You know, and there are some amazing collectors in Shanghai, which you could really hit it off with. I get that sort of stuff, but I just don't care about it. It's a waste of time for me to even worry about that kind of thing. Now, last year I had planned to go and cover the US election and do a east to west coast photographic essay at that tumultuous time, but COVID prevented that.
Right.
So rather than sort of be upset that I couldn't travel, I had to make do with what I could do, which was to be here in South Australia. But yeah, the point of your question is really about why spend so much time focusing on this state as compared to the eastern states, really. I mean, there's an east-west a divide between Sydney and Melbourne and Adelaide. And yes, there are more collectors who pay higher prices for work of value in the eastern states compared to here. I just can't begin to approach that question because, if I spend 3 hours worrying about that and trying to arrange latte meetings in Glebe or Vaucluse, I've just spent 3 hours that I can't be out shooting.
Yeah. Well, the hidden agenda, not so much agenda, what promoted that question is back in my days when I worked in some religious circles, there was much said about this monk who had spent his whole life in this part of Scotland, in a little village, little town, and he's sought after because he brings great reflection and wisdom that we might think you only get from travelling the world. But he got it from that discipline of staying in place, which then forces him, in that case, to go deeply introspective and probably see things we might not see. And I hold that intention also with humankind's quest for space, but we don't really know what's at the bottom of the ocean. And heaven, I'm doing a podcast for ClinPath, This Pathological Life. Yeah. There is so much about the body we still don't understand. So to me, I put your decision to stay and be still and reflect in one local place can tap into the universal as much as anything else.
And I think I've only just started to scratch the surface. And South Australia is 5 times bigger than the UK and much bigger than Texas. Yeah. So there's still a lot of this state that I'm yet to even get to. And there are demographics and there are subsets and cultures within cultures and subcultures within subcultures that I'm yet to explore with my camera, which I could start exploring today.
Well, there's one thing that I was surprised by in your book, which we'll have a link to, by the way, in the show notes so people can go and purchase this.
Fabulous.
It was shot up on Eagle on the Hill, and just that I referenced it earlier, this autumnal palette that I'd never really noticed before. It was this soft saturation of greens and reds and browns and a tinge of yellow, and then you had the beautiful bluey grey background.
Fog as well, I think.
Yeah.
Fog in the background.
Yes, a bit of fog. That's right. And I walked those pathways. I don't ever remember seeing that palette before, and it made me stop and go, oh, wow, that's beautiful.
And it's inviting to that kind of landscape. I'm asking the viewer to walk into that world with me, to see that world and to experience the Gerard Manley Hopkins, what he would call the inscape, the beauty that lies within the thing itself. And, he believed that if you were there and you could feel it, you would, have an emotion. He called it in-stress. He then said that if you didn't feel it, that's okay. It's all right. But if you did, you're lucky. It's there. It's there to be seen. And he was going against that old idiom of beauty in the eye of the beholder. He said, no, not really. He said, beauty's there in everything. It's just if you see it, you're lucky. And if you don't, it doesn't matter. You'll see it in something else.
If only I'd known that when I was dating.
Rules for life.
Yes. But to take that one step further with you helping me see a palette that I've been surrounded by without seeing, light itself.
Yes.
What's been your journey of awakening with light from growing up in England to then becoming an Aussie out here, farm country as well as cityscape? Can you just...
Here's the thing with light. So it's the twin composition and light are the two big elements for me in photography. The thing about light in South Australia is that it's really hard to get good light. And so what you have to do is be up early and out late. So during the middle of the day, there is no shooting for me because the sun is directly above. creates ugly shadows, and no camera can combat that kind of harsh lighting. South Australia has particularly harsh lighting. At the moment, we're in the middle of winter, it's less harsh, but during the midday in winter, it's still harsh here. So that's hard.
Just a note.
Yes.
We've got a history of hard water as well. So
Indeed.
hard water and hard life.
Oh,
hard light.
How can anyone live here? If it weren't for the cream buns and frits and fruit chocks,
Yes.
no one would live here.
That's
It'd be
right.
deserted.
I interrupted you. Sorry.
One has to be accustomed to shooting early mornings and evenings. That means that you're not shooting through the middle of the day. So during the middle of the day, you're looking for things to shoot, working on projects, collaborating, commissions, this kind of thing. So, I became aware that this is the lot of photographers who wish to shoot exteriors, which is what I do. I don't shoot interiors. I don't shoot a lot of studio stuff, conceptual works. I'm always out and about in the world because I believe, as the way that Miles Davis thought jazz was a social music, I believe that photography is a social art form. I think it's an essential art form. Oh, jeez. Sorry about that.
What's that? Is that your phone?
Yeah.
Oh, that's beautiful. That just shows how life interrupts us at all times.
Arpeggio.
Beautiful.
Sorry about that. Where were we?
We were outside.
Yeah, outside.
In the
and
exterior.
Miles Davis talked of jazz music as being a social art form.
It would have been fitting if it was a Miles Davis ring tune. That would have just sealed the deal.
One of my heroes.
Yes.
And as the foreword in the book mentions, that Miles Davis had said that it's the silences that make a phrase beautiful sometimes, how to play a silence.
Yes.
I think if I can get that essence into a photograph and be minimal
Yes.
and large, I think I'm adhering to one of his great rules of music is less is more, really.
We might even take that as a note for interviews in the future, that it's the silence between the ringtones is when the interview happens.
Indeed, yes. It's when the magic occurs.
But we interrupted you again. So you're an exterior photographer. You use natural light, God's light.
Therefore, I have to know that the best times to shoot are early in the morning and late in the evening. And that's tough because it means that when everyone's at work, you can't be out there doing what you love in the middle of the day. It's a rule I live by, and I tell students who ask me, I say, if you want 30% better shots, shoot early and shoot late. Easy.
All right. Your dad, of course, had a quest to go out to the outback of Australia, if I am correct.
Well, my mum came from the outback. She was from a pastoral lease. Dad was a city, and when they married, they decided that they wanted to be living a rural existence, and so they purchased land near Strathalbyn.
Right. And that, of course, meant you got taken to these places.
Yeah.
And there's a comment that Murray picks up in your foreword that fascinates me. When you first saw the outback, you were struck by the nothingness of it, the photographic nothingness, the negative space.
The apparent photographic negative space, the nothingness. And that's true. Obviously, there's 60,000 years of cultural meaning in there. But for me, at the age of 6 and to the age of 10, I was seeing the Mallee. Now, the Mallee is a great swathe of land that really goes from the river to the border of Victoria. And it's arid, and it's low rainfall, it's flat, and it's difficult to photograph. But that's what I was surrounded by in my formative years of photography. So I had to get used to that negative space, and use it. And I think the benefit of having sort of nothing to shoot is that when you find something, it has real meaning.
So how does a photographer frame nothing? What is this where moving the camera higher, lower makes a difference?
Choice of lens, choice of film emulsion comes into play, but really the ability to frame negative space, or what I would call minimalist photography, means that you're really exercising the visual side of your visual memory, your ability to compose. That becomes really important because there just simply isn't infrastructure. There aren't people around. There are no animals apart from sheep. You really have to be resourceful and use every ounce of your creativity to get that difficult landscape to come alive.
Do you resort, if that's the word, to capturing something that really is just a nature's colour palette sample?
You've got it. Now that's it. That's the key. What you end up doing is you resort back to real basic principles of photography, of colour palette, tonality, monochrome if you're shooting black and white, minimalism, formalism. You're right. You end up coming back to real basics of photography, which really forces you to be resourceful. And I think, some of the images, there's lots in the book from the Mallee, because that's where I spent a lot of time. I was just really interested in those aspects of photography which, people take for granted. The gradual, the graduations in the skies.
Yes.
The sunsets where it goes pink, orange, yellow, magenta, light blue, blue, dark blue. That's ultimately pleasurable for me to shoot, because it's just, you're dealing with the elements. It's like you're dealing with earth, wind and fire. You're dealing with the real basics of photography.
And yet you still say the Mallee is unconquered by you at this point. It still has the upper hand. You haven't tamed it. You haven't corralled it.
I drove out to Karoonda last week because my images are on the Karoonda silos for the month of June as part of the Karoonda Silo Art Project. And I ventured into some country that I hadn't been through before and saw new things. And this is the lot of the photographers, that you never feel that you've finished a project because there's so much more to shoot. And this is something that I'm becoming accustomed to, is never feeling that I've actually spoken on behalf of in a 100% truly formed way, that I always want to go back and explore more. I mean, there's Nagarkat, which is the national park, which is further east of Karoonda, on the Lamaroo, Pinaroo, Nagarkat.
Yep. Not far from Tintinarra, where my good lady wife comes from.
Right, yeah. And a beautiful swathe of land that's, I've only been a couple of times. I could see myself returning there 10, 20 times.
Right.
This is the nature of the obsessive side of photography. That you never feel that you don't hit and run. You don't sort of go somewhere, especially far away, and just sort of come back and think, oh, what did I get? Pull out a bag of images. No, it's more than that. It's art. So you're constantly finding new ways into a place that are interesting. You're not a tourist. You're not just there to sort of clock up miles and Facebook check in and look where I am today. No.
I'm going to return to that. So just park in the Nagarkat car park and just come back a moment, because when we were talking about that shot where you really have some images, some frames in your book, absolutely beautiful. They're gradations, if you like, of colour, whereas others have clear subjects that you work with. I also noticed that there, some that are landscape, some that are oriented portrait, some that are square.
Yeah.
Is there an easy way to describe to us the thinking process that determines which mode you choose? And also, even with the landscape, there are some that are quite shallow and thin, and others that go deeper, almost fat, sort of rectangular.
Really, we're dealing with film formats and sizes. And, if you think of the traditional rectangle, which we call a landscape, that really goes back to, for me, the idea of a Western. The camera panning left to right across the mountains as the hero sort of comes into frame wearing a black hat. Clint Eastwood in High Plains Drifter, or Shane at the end of Shane. I use a square format, which is great for a vertically stacked image. So a vertically stacked landscape, to me, is an Asian aesthetic. So Asian art tends to see things from top to bottom. If you look at an Asian artist's depiction of a river, for example, it tends not to be left to right like in a Western. It tends to be mountains at the top, the river, and then the foreground stacked top to bottom vertically. And if you look at Japanese art, very much a part of the thinking. It's the way that different cultures look at art. For example, Arabic, which is written right to left. If they're panning in a Western, if you can imagine an Arabic Western, they're going to pan right to left because they write right to left as cultural. Whereas the Western, in a Western sense, is left to right because we write left to right. So if it's a great big Western type shot, it's going to be a rectangle. If it's a square, if it's a integrated vertically type of image, I'm going to use my square format camera because it's tall.
Yeah.
A square is taller than a rectangle. Yeah.
So you don't. When do you make that decision? When you get the camera out?
After a while, you get to be able to predict what you're going to be seeing, and if you've been there before, which is often the case with me, like I said, I'm going back to locations multiple times, refining my visual sense of that location. I'm going to be planning beforehand what cameras to bring.
Yes, and I've still got a little bit more to go on that way in just a moment. We're going to come back to that. Because before we get to my triple header question that I've been looking forward to hitting you with, I want to deal with nighttime. People know you for the Adelaide Noir series.
That was the first series I did, which was printed in a book, yes.
But there's a lovely comment that you make, or is captured by Murray on your behalf in the forward, from your filmic start to your career.
Pedigree.
Yes. You make a comment that filmmakers prefer nighttime, night lighting, the night aesthetic.
Yes.
Now, as a photographer, sometimes, I mean, sure, even a filmmaker, isn't there an issue with graininess as trying to capture blackness and film reaching the edge of
the
its
limits of what it's capable of capturing without getting grainy and grungy.
Yeah, which is not so bad. I mean, I love some good grain in my mulchi.
Oh, yeah.
But what do you still... Is nighttime a favourite time of yours? Or?
It always is, and it's with, especially this is where digital cameras come into the fore, because they are uniformly better than film cameras at getting night images. There's no grain. You can have a long exposure of 10 or 20 seconds and have the aperture on the camera open with the shutter open for half a minute, allowing all that night light to come in. And night light can be quite bright. For example, on a full moon night, you're going to have lots of lighting in parks and car parks and shopping centres and roads. They all look lit. And when you take a long exposure of that kind of scene, you end up with an image which looks a bit like day.
Yeah. Can I just pause for 1 second?
Yeah.
Last year, I was at the Prairie Hotel.
Where's that?
Parachilna.
Oh, yeah. Yep,
right up north.
Yeah.
And I was out. I took a wander in the scrub.
Yep.
And I had my iPhone 12 Pro, whatever.
Yes.
And I rested it against a sleeper, so it was still. I had no tripod with me. Because a semi-trailer, a road train, had pulled over on the side of the road near me. And I thought, I'm going to take a shot of that. And I very gently touched the shutter. And the exposure, I think, lasted a good 20 seconds.
Yeah.
When I saw the picture, it was daytime.
Yeah, because you're letting so much light in with that long shutter speed. Now, the average shutter speed for a daytime photograph is about 1/60th of a second. And if you're shooting a moving object like a car or a bird, it's a thousandth of a second. So at a long exposure at night, you're adding huge amounts of light to the digital chip over a period of 30 seconds. That's a lot of light coming in. So it's no surprise that when you look at the result of that, it looks like a very well-lit daytime shot with a touch of surrealism.
Yes.
Because the shadows look different, because often if you're shooting with street lights, the shadows are casting, the lights are casting shadows in strange directions because it's not the sun, it's a street light.
Of
And if
course.
it's the moon, it's casting a beautiful soft shadow or a sort of a halo around an object. This causes a viewer of the image to be in a state of somewhat confused dissembling of the image, because they're used to seeing it a certain way and they're seeing it strangely, shadows are in different places. And that was what people were attracted to in the first series I did, which was all shot at night, Adelaide Noir. And those images came about because I was actually scouting around for film locations for a film that I was wanting to make and taking shots of locations at night. And people used to sort of look at these images that I'd taken and say, well, how much for them?
Wow.
And they would also say things like, well, Alex, we read your script and we think it's actually pretty rubbish. But I tell you what, we like the shots you took when you were out hunting for locations. we'd like to buy one of those images and stick it on our wall. And that's really how the collector side of my business started. That's how it happened.
So your career now is a legacy of happenstance.
Yes. Knockback scripts versus, images acquired.
Is there still a movie you want to make? Can you share a storyline with us?
I haven't really thought about scripts and movies for a long time because, there's so much thinking that has to go into making new work for the photographic side of things. But I'm sure something will come up one day. I mean, there are many stories that I've actually encountered in real life on the road, shooting the various parts of South Australia that I'm sure will be collated into a sort of gonzo journalistic movie, perhaps.
All right, I'll let me know, and I'll book my ticket at the Mercury Cinema when the time is right.
That's right, at midnight on a Saturday night.
Now, landscape photography, we'll come back to the reason that brought us here. Indeed, even art itself requires patience. And I think it's patience from three parties. We have the artist, we have the audience, and we also have the patron, the benefactor, the client who's funding it.
Yes.
And I'd like to look at each one turn by turn, if we may, and start with you, the artist. We've already talked about you've got these thin windows at the beginning and end of the day to get the shot at the quality with the light you want. Yeah. How many times does that require you to return to a location? And what makes you ultimately decide you've either got it or, alternatively, you're giving up?
Before even going to the locations, the artist has to decide the context of the image. So every time I'm out shooting something, it's in a wider context, and that context is what's drawing me to that location. I don't just randomly fly around the place hoping to bump into things which I can then return to with different cameras. For example, I've just come back from Beltana. I wanted to shoot all the old Ghan railway towns that were on that eastern side of the Flinders Ranges. Before that, I was on the western side of the Flinders Ranges at towns like Tarcoola, the ghost town of Tarcoola, wanting to see that and experience that amazing ghost town, our only true ghost town. So there's always context before I even get in the car to go to a location. Once I go to the location, then there's a mixture of luck, timing, being on your game, being aware, and being fast. And I've gotten faster over the years. I've been able to see things quicker and capture them because speed is important. The light changes within seconds. If the sun disappears and if there are clouds for the rest of the day, that image can look really dull. So it really does revolve around seconds and microseconds because when you pop that shutter, you want to make sure the light is right, the composition's good. And if you're not on your game, those things aren't going to be there because you're going to be slow. You're going to be flailing. You're going to have the light might be disappearing. You've got 3 minutes to shoot the shot. And if you don't have the chops, from a musical background, the chops aren't there, you're going to be failing every time. You're going to be going on return journeys, which cost petrol, which cost time and money.
What would we see if we were watching you? What would you look like to us?
Yes, people who come on shoots with me often remark that I become like some sort of crazed animal when on location and shooting. And I really do go into a very focused zone. I get right into the moment and the feeling of it compels me to sort of be a certain way. And I think some people find that very abject and very other. And they sort of think of me as the folksy guy that they play tennis with or play golf with or go to a film with. It's not like I'm not like that person. I'm a completely different person when I'm shooting. I guess that's the same with a musician. Doesn't look like a musician when they're not being a musician. So Miles Davis, in his social world, would look very different to when he's on stage.
Is there ever occasion for expletives?
A lot of it's non-verbal because words don't matter. When you're shooting, what you say is just going to have no bearing on anything because it's a completely different art form. It's a silent art form, really. Stills, isn't it? It's not like filmmaking or music, which is has an audio component. Stills is silent, and that's both its liberator and its oppressor. So I don't really talk while I'm shooting. I mean, if I'm with a subject, if I'm on country with an Indigenous person, I'll be talking the whole time. But if it's there as a solo thing, there's no expletive. There's just let's get the shot in my head, and then I can tell you some stories that that I've learned a great deal from. Some crazy ones too.
Why don't you share one?
Well, I was up at Lake Barmera about 3 years ago, and it's one of my favourite locations in South Australia to shoot because you get these dead trees or ghost trees or flame trees that I call them in the middle of the lake. The lake's only shallow at the shoreline, and in the book there'll be a few photos in there that you can see of water, fresh water, and a single tree. It's hard to actually shoot one tree on its own. It's something you don't see very often. It's a challenge I give to students. Go and shoot one tree. Hard. So took a roll of slide film and a big 6x9 Fuji camera up to the Riverland, and I was up to my waist in water, and I was using a rangefinder camera. Now, a rangefinder camera is not an SLR. An SLR is a camera where you look through the lens and you see what the lens sees. A rangefinder camera, you actually offset your looking through a little window to the left of the view of the actual lens. And shall I just say that if one were to leave the lens cap on a rangefinder camera, one would not know it, right? So I shot a couple of rolls, and I was very happy about what I'd shot. And I was in my head, I was banking the sales of, I was thinking, what editions will I sell these at? Maybe one of ones. Maybe if there's 5 that are good, I can sell them as one of ones, or maybe I'll sell them as editions of 10. And doing all that forward thinking. Now, on the way home, I remember looking across at the passenger seat, and the big camera was sitting there, as it always does after a shoot. I often just keep it on the passenger seat, sitting there with its lens cap on. And I thought to myself, well done, Alex. You've actually shot a day of film. You've shot for a day and not lost the lens cap. You've actually managed to put it back on at the end of the shoot. And then by about Waikerie, I started to think, perhaps I didn't even take the lens cap off to begin with. And, of course, we're not talking digital cameras where you can actually look at it's film cameras. So by the time we got to Scotty's Motel, I was pretty certain that I hadn't even taken the lens cap off, and I'd shot rolls of film with lens cap on. The next day, the lab called about midday and said, Alex, there's no density on the film, which is their polite way of saying it's all black. So these things loom large. When you have an experience like that, you never do it again. And you learn that if your technique is lacking, and if your mind isn't in that really focused zone, that you're going to make mistakes. And that was a costly mistake because it's a lot of travel time, a lot of petrol. It's a favourite location, and I've been there twice since then and not made that same mistake, and come back with images that I was really happy with.
Okay.
Yeah, so it wasn't as if I couldn't go back there again.
True.
However, that condition that you were filming, that day that the mistake happened, you'll never get that again. And that is, again, that's the fun or the beauty of photography is when you take an image, it's of a moment in time that can never, ever, ever, ever be replicated. Ever.
And that's part of the muscle memory you're talking about now, isn't it?
Yeah.
I don't know if you've noticed, but when we started, for the first few minutes, I keep glancing to make sure there's a red light next to the record button on this recorder.
I can relate.
Because I have lost a couple of chats, but doubt there'll be any more.
Sure, and that gets back to also how to back up stuff, and with physical film, I'm having to sort of find ways of storing huge folders full of negatives, because if they go, they're gone, they can't be replaced. But you can scan, and I do digitize everything I shoot, so it ends up on a hard drive.
But surely they wouldn't. That'd be easy to store. They'd just be negative space, wouldn't they?
That's right. Boom, boom. Did they call you a killer the pun at school?
I wish they had.
Right.
So that's the artist and patience. I want to talk about the audience now from our perspective, because you've got this beautiful, I guess, would we call that a coffee table book? Is that a genre, or do you? That's
the way that people can relate to the book. They can see it as a coffee table book. I don't drink coffee, but I can see that book, in fact, I've seen it on many coffee tables, so that would perhaps say, yes, it is a coffee table book. It's really an art book.
Okay. Whether it's coffee table or an art book, here's my question. Who is the audience for such books in 2021 and beyond? And I ask that because life for many of us happens now at a pace I can't remember life ever happening at before. And I run my own business. I hardly have a moment to stop. And a book like this demands time to stop. Talk us through, how do you imagine your art being consumed in this medium in 2021?
In a crowded field too. I mean, you go into a bookstore and there are lots of photography books. Some self-published, some with a publisher, some with big publishers. So a competitive market. I think that COVID has informed the particularly South Australians' view of South Australia because they're being urged to visit the regions.
As Rodney Harricks pointed out a couple of episodes ago.
Indeed, he did. And if he's read the book, he will see much of the state covered in various chapters of the book. But I think at this time, in the COVID era, I think people are actually resorting back to those simple things, such as looking at a book, opening a book and reading it, and not doing anything else. I mean, that was enforced at a point. Sometimes people couldn't go out. We've had 2 lockdowns, I think, in South Australia. Victorians more. So, you know, that has been perhaps a benefit of this strange era in which we live, is that people are taking time to hold something and look at images and to read books. I mean, that's lucky for me if that's the case. I mean, what I do know is that we printed 1,000 of the book and they were pretty much gone after 3 months. Now we have to have a reprint done, which is inconvenient because it means that there are no copies of the book at the moment really around town. There are a few in stores, but we're having to get another print run done, which will only arrive in August. So Michael Boland, the publisher, said, well, sorry, we could have done 2,000. But, he has to approach everything conservatively, because printing books is an expensive business. And look, I think I wouldn't have changed a thing. I think the way it happened, the boat came in, I think, 24 December, day before Christmas, and we sold a lot over the break. I was amazed at how fast it was going.
Well, that brings us to the third of the patience trifecta, that of the publisher. In this case, it's Wakefield Press. Do they have a certain mindset that allows time for the momentum to build and to take the long... I mean, what was there a conversation about deciding on 1,000 and could have been 2,000? What was happening? Not many of us get to go behind the scenes to this.
Behind the scenes at a publisher like Wakefield Press, it's very chaotic because they have so many books that they publish, because they are pretty much the only established major publisher in town. And, Michael works his ass off getting through that roster. So the first thing to say is I'm very lucky to even be a part of that scene. I mean, I had done 2 books before with them, so they knew how I worked. But I think it's a privilege to actually have a publisher come in and say, look, we would like to publish your book. So behind the scenes, I work with a designer, Nick Phillips, who had worked with me on my previous book, which was the portraits book, and that took 2 years because we never felt that we had finished. We kept wanting to shoot more and more. And Michael Boland said, there's no point in rushing into a book if we feel that we don't have enough images, or that perhaps the images were all fluoro and south. So I didn't have a lot of the north after year 1. After year 2, I think I had more of the north. And after year 3, I had east, west, north, south. I had really gone further and further. So at the end of year 3, we had a great selection of images from which to choose to put the book together. We felt that it was the right time, but we didn't give ourselves any deadlines. Back 3 years before, we didn't sort of say to ourselves, 2021's our year. We didn't think like that. We just thought the year will be right. The time will be when we have the images, and that just was a matter of time. And when I felt that I had given it my all, and that that it was the right time to put it down into print.
And look, just out of you've drawn me in now. Does someone like a Wakefield Press give you an advance like we hear the great authors talk about, or is it, how does that work? And tell me to butt out if I'm getting too personal. I imagine there's some people very curious about that.
I think it's a standard agreement that they offer everybody, and I happen to choose the option where I got given a whole lot of the book at the beginning. So in lieu of cash, physical copies of the book. So, that in the end sort of doomed us, because I got 50 books to begin with. Flinders Uni rung up and wanted 100. So this is day 2. We had Cobham Air, the CEO, bought 40. And so after day 3 or 4, we'd gone through a third of the books. So, getting back to that question of 1,000 versus 2,000, I don't have a problem with the fact that we probably should have had 2,000. I wouldn't have known any better. It wasn't for me to sort of make that call. It's for an experienced publisher, and it does give you a second bite of the cherry. You can actually change a few things in that second print run. Little errors. There are a couple tiny errors, but I'm happy. And by the time that Illuminate happens, the book will be out.
Yes. I mean, I was perplexed by the photo of the Sydney Harbour Bridge in that book.
Well, yes. I mean, and what about the Golden Gate?
I know.
I quite like that shot we did in Dallas. In Phoenix.
I want to come back, though, with the audience thing and us in engaging with your work. It's uncommon to see a human without a mobile phone in their hand. That distraction, they've been designed to distract us. Does that sadden you about us? Because it means that you need people who either know how to be without their mobile phone or can have a period without it, because surely it must kill your soul to see someone holding your book with phone in hand and glancing back and forth as things ping.
There are many things not to like about mobile phones, but there are many things to like about mobile phones. And I think one leg of my business model is social media. And the images came to prominence, as Facebook and Instagram happened, the rise of that through the noughties. I was posting work daily, which I still do. And that has enabled collectors to see the work straight away and to buy the work, which has enabled a book to happen. So whichever way I look at it, I think mobile phones are actually more of a benefit than a hazard. There's a line from Blade Runner. I do, however, worry that a lot of people, rather than getting an old SLR out or buying a digital SLR, are shooting stills on a mobile phone and not giving their potential full voice through longer lenses, zoom lenses that you can achieve with standard cameras, which cannot be copied with a mobile phone. So I know people who have great composition and lighting skills who are held back by the fact that they're walking around with a mobile phone thinking that it's a great substitute for an SLR. It isn't. Never can be.
No, not a substitute, but it can complement, can't it?
Can complement and can be a great record-keeping device. I mean, I'm always pulling out my mobile phone and taking stills of locations, which I will return to film with a proper camera. So.
That explains why you were doing that during this interview, photographing me a few times.
I was actually. I was photographing him multiple times, multiple angles.
Yes. But I ignored it and didn't even draw it.
As a true professional would.
Yes. However, there was one other thing in the forward that I need to touch base on. The comment about quitting filmmaking, and we talked about it just earlier, because selling your photography was more lucrative. That struck me as counterintuitive in this age, because there are people sell their photos online for 20 cents or for free, etc. How has this come to be for Alex Frayne?
It was really the medium offered a better way of expressing myself. I mean, that's really the heart and soul of that switch, that osmosis from filmmaking to stills capturing. I really felt it was the natural form for me. And it was abundantly clear to me that I felt that I could express exactly what I had been trying to express through film, but through stills, and do it much more efficiently and quicker, and create a body of work which is new and it stands apart from filmmaking.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a much better for me and a tool for expression, stills. But, that was a long time ago. I mean, it wasn't yesterday. That was 20 years ago that, having studied film and, had filmmaking friends and been around film people and sort of, seen the way that films are made through them, I felt that I had to go out on my own and find a form and express myself strongly and quickly. I just felt that there was no way that I could be a part of that film fabric, particularly in that era when film funding was going through conniptions in Australia and, successive governments were cutting funding and seeing the pain that exacted on some of my colleagues.
Yes.
I just thought, it's not for me. I have to be prolific another way. So that's how it happened.
Payday too far away.
That's what. So, yeah. What's the byline on the poster? Friday too drunk, Saturday too tired, Sunday too far away.
Yes. Which, by the way, as an aside, I held a screening of when I lived in Budapest for a couple of years for the Australian-Hungarian Business Association. The SA Film Corp actually flew it over to us for free.
They would have had a print, lying around in the vault, which they shipped over. Was it a 35mm print or a DVD?
No, big print, proper film in the projector.
That would have been a fabulous thing to watch.
Which reminds me, I should have returned it to them. But,
You've kept it.
It's okay. No one from there listens to this podcast. The couple of things coming up, then I want to finish with a couple of light ones. My favourite shot from the book, Landscapes of South Australia. Do you want to have a guess which one it is?
Well, it's clearly not the Maslins photo. That would be too obvious. Is it the shot of Tent Hill, north of Port Augusta?
No.
We could go on like this for 215 attempts.
I'll tell you it's a nighttime shot and then give you one last bite of the cherry and then...
It's in the Mallee. It's the man sitting outside on the porch at night.
And it's not that either.
Right.
Are you really Alex Frame? Okay, here it is. This, to me, is one of the most beautiful shots. It's called The Long Dark, and it was shot at Wistow in the Adelaide Hills. It's an Ampol service station, adequately lit on the left of the frame with the road out the front, which disappears into a black, dark infinity. And it just slammed the brakes on my leafing through the book, and I just had to stare at that. Because there's a couple of things that it evoked for me, and you probably get to hear people talk about your photos all the time. Just move me on if I get to.
No, you can stay there.
It was a sense of, it was symbolic of how much we rely on the light to cling to for safety. Yes. And how, when we're in our cars, we take for granted, because we've got the headlights, that little bubble of light follows us. But without that, we are out into the nothingness. Yeah. And there's a little quip you made about filmmakers symbolically using the Australian landscape as a symbol of fear, where there is danger, whereas you don't like that. You prefer that it's a revelatory place. It reveals stuff. And this, to me, just made me reflect on how much it's the absence of light that scares us to our bones, because in our civilization, we're almost never without light. Even when we're sleeping, there's a glow from something. What were you hoping to convey with that, and what made you take that photograph?
If the universe is a dark place, it is the stars in the sky that light the darkness. So like you say, that small cone of light is hope. To me, it's hope, and it's a positive thing. It means that I'm able to move through the darkness surrounded by light. Without that, well, it's a dark place to be. So when I'm travelling at night, headlights on, through dark spots, with the music loud, I'm on top of the world. There's no fear there for me. There's no grim Aussie, outback darkness tropes that you see in every movie that's shot here. Boring. To me, it's a positive thing. I'm moving, trajectory, surrounded by light. I'm a particle in a huge universe that's, lit.
And what just surprised me now as I reflected on it more is we are creatures that dwell in the light. I mean, without the sun, we don't exist. And yet, even though the Ampole service station is there, I was looking into the darkness.
Yeah.
Why? Why was I not looking at the Ampole service station?
Gets back to composition. So when composing, after a while and after years of practice, photographer gets to know what works visually for an audience, or a photographer can readily transplant him or herself into the subjectivity of the viewer. And I just know that the placement of that Ampole on the left, with the lines of the road dragging us into the frame, I just know that that's how it's going to play out. I know that you're going to be drawn straight to the middle of the shot.
I fell for that trick, didn't I? Those dotted lines, that's what you were doing, wasn't it?
Mind control. Psychops.
I pride myself on colouring outside the lines, but I just followed those lines in your photograph.
And if you interviewed 100 people who also saw the image, they would say that they had the same experience, the same visual experience. I think at the end of the day, I'm trying to give people a visual experience. Yeah. It is a visual art form.
So I'm just like everybody else. Wow.
That ain't so
what
bad.
A dark ending to this journey. A couple of light things. Light Visions, Dark Intervals, coming up in July or also July?
July 23rd at the Town Hall with Paul Grabowski.
Tell us about this. This is part of the what's it? Illuminate Festival.
Big new festival, the Winter Festival, which is in its first year this year, with inaugural year. I am friends with Paul Grabowski, who's a virtuoso piano player, and I pitched an idea to the artistic directors of the festival, Lee Cumberledge and Rachel Azzopardi, and that idea was, how about if we have a musician walk into the town hall and be seated at a piano and have to respond in real time to a series of images that come up on a huge screen.
That he's never seen before?
That he's never seen before. He knows my work, of course, but it's he's going to respond in real time to a series of images that he sees at the same time as the audience.
Wow.
That'll be interesting, because I don't know how that's going to play out. And that's what's great about it for me, is that not knowing the newness of this kind of idea, for me, is the juice.
Yes. Can you please make sure the long dark is one of them? Because I'd love to come and see how he responds to that.
Well, if Paul heard this podcast, he would then know what the image was that he was to play to. The thing is, there's only going to be seven master images over an hour. So it's not a slideshow of Alex Frayne photographs with Paul sort of playing along to them. It's much more specific than that. He will have to play to one image for 10 minutes and develop ideas and musically interpret and act as a conduit, really, between two disparate art forms of music and photography.
I wonder how he's practicing.
We've had very little discussion about the project, obviously to preserve the integrity of the project, but I think Paul is drawn to the idea naturally because he's an improviser. He comes from a jazz pedigree, so he's able to interpret visual signals in a musical way. He has said things like, "I want it to be raw. I want it to be impromptu. I want it to be unrehearsed." And so I take on it all these key words that he occasionally flicks to me, and sort of have to then go to the images and put together a program, which I've finished this week. We've just locked it off. The editor and myself have locked it off. And it's strange, because the first thing I'd love to do is send it to him and say, "Here you go, Paul, here's what you'll be playing to," but I can't.
No.
So the images will only be seen by myself and the editor.
Now, I just want to call him up on this. If he's seriously wanting raw, you should do the reverse ticket protocol they do at the Edinburgh Fringe in places where no one pays unless they were happy, and then they pay on the way out. Now, that would be
ballsy. That would be tough art.
Maybe half. You get yours because you don't want to do that. But for his half, it could depend on that.
Depend on performance KPIs. I mean, they exist in the corporate world. Why shouldn't they exist in the artistic world?
Yeah. And look, talking of KPIs, it'd be remiss of me not to give you a chance to to pitch the book to us. Why should someone buy Landscapes of South Australia? Or at least get a forward order going so that when the new edition comes out, they get a copy.
I think Landscapes of South Australia's main appeal is in the strange and different ways in which I've gone about shooting this state. Now, most people have an image of South Australia which is born from what I would call myth, propaganda, the media, the government. The government will actually push out images which they think you'll find appealing so that you'll go and visit those places. That is of no interest to me. What is interesting to me is the inherent beauty of the state, how it expresses itself to me, how it sings, how it gives itself voice through the way I shoot it. I think if you want to be a part of that revelation and to experience the joy that I myself have experienced shooting the book, I think you should get it. I think you should partake in that experience. I think, it's one that it won't remind you of anything you've seen in terms of this state in the far north, particularly in the far north. Very different to common and regurgitated representations of South Australia that we see almost on an hourly basis. I know Rodney Harricks would probably be very upset at what I've just said. But it's an artistic view of the state, not a tourist view of the state.
Mind you, I think if Rodney Harricks and his team looked through your book, there is scope for a campaign to attract the art lovers to this state.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, indeed, there have been artists inspired by the landscapes of South Australia. I mean, Hans Hyson comes to mind.
But if Rodney et al. Do that, I only take 5% commission from that.
Yeah, and I'll charge 15.
Wow. Alex Frayne, to finish off with, you've inspired many of us listening and seeing the book. Can you set us an exercise to teach us, to help us with our cameras, preferably an SLR if we've got them, but if not, just our smartphone, to help see the commonly seen anew? What's a little thing we could be doing next weekend or tonight or whenever?
Here's an exercise. The exercise is to shoot one thing only. So one tree in a paddock, one rusted old fence going along a perimeter of a property, one flower, one animal in a landscape. Quite a challenging thing to do, but it's a good exercise because it means you're going to have to go out and look for that thing. I mean, there is a tree on its own on a hill at Brown Hill. So I don't want everyone going out and shooting that one tree. There are many other solo trees, and I love shooting solo trees because they actually speak to me of resilience, especially out in the marginal rainfall territories in the mid-north and the Mallee. To me, those shots are not about the tree in the paddock. It's actually about the human spirit being resilient in low rainfall areas. Find one thing to shoot. So many amateurs go and shoot many things in the frame because their brain can't declutter and they can't actually sort through the various elements of the frame and put them in a nice, logical, easy to look at way. Most amateurs will shoot an image which is full of information, which can't be decluttered. And I can always tell better photographers from weaker photographers by the fact that the better photographer can actually separate elements out and show them visually. One tree in a paddock, one cow in a field.
Even if there are other cows there, we put the focus on one, or you
find one that you like and shoot it and exclude the others. And then you've got melancholy because, this is what mood is all about. You're creating mood. You can edit out the others by just shooing them away and finding one that you want to shoot that in a paddock, and you've got an image which is far more melancholic than just shooting the lot of them.
And it would be easier to get that if you're shooting a solitary cow, to have that melancholy mood.
Yeah, because a single cow in a paddock is actually quite rare. Usually they're in a herd. If they're on their own, it means they're injured.
Wow. And finally, promotes the last thing, a favourite little anecdote from going out and shooting on location, something fun that happened, surprising that happened, memorable. How would you finish off with? dust this little cupcake of audio with some icing.
I'm going to say one word, Woomera. What a place. Go there and feel the weirdness of the place. This is the place where 50 years ago, rocket men and women had the dreams of space and descended on the town en masse, funded by the British government, the Australian government. There was a joint venture space project that happened at Woomera, which is sort of being talked about as being revitalised. But go to Woomera and see the artefacts of the dreams and nightmares of the 20th century Cold War.
Alex Frayne, thanks for joining the Adelaide Show.
It's been a pleasure, Steve. Thank you.
And now it's time for the musical pilgrimage.
In the musical pilgrimage this week, we have a song from Magic Tortoise. I thought I've heard it all when it comes to band names, but Magic Tortoise takes the cake so far, albeit at a very slow pace. Tim Seeley is the band member I met from this trio. They perform what they dub as quirky, atmospheric, alt folk music. And that's alt as in alternative folk, not alt as in old folk. And you're going to get a taste of that right now. I think meeting Tim on Hamilton Island, perfect place for a tortoise, I think. I didn't bump into any tortoises, but who's to say they weren't there? There were plenty of cockatoos around, and I've seen a cockatoo on my balcony while I was staying there. During my little sojourn in which I was performing as Professor Longsword for a national conference. Such is life. So I probably need to go to this place where they're performing soon. If you're listening to this before Friday, August 2021, pop along on that night to see Magic Tortoise at Captain Rehab's at Niles Street in Port Adelaide. But right now, we're going to tie up all the themes of tonight in the name of this song. It's called Wild. Here's Magic Tortoise.
Dog after a ball, snatching at your sleeve, sniffing every bumhole, begging for a treat. Too scared of the wild, stop playing in safety of the game. Sitting at the wire, too bored, too tired to be tamed. Dingo on a mountain, hunter as a steer, bullet through the tail, blood on the trail, now we're keeping it clear. Too scared of the wild, start playing in safety of the game. Sitting at the wire, too bored, too tired to be tamed. Feel it, feel it, feel it, feel it. Delirium is a major who you are. Your gold and silver from exploding stars. 10 million years of major who you are. Your gold and silver from exploding stars. Too scared of the wild stuff playing in safety of the game. Sitting at the wire, two boards get tired to be tame. How about them tears? The weight of this moment so blue. Another light has passed, set you on your cross. The endings bring form to the
Magic Tortoise, Wild, and that's it. That's all for episode 332 of the Adelaide Show podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Please share the podcast with some friends, maybe even some enemies. You might convert them. Until next time, it's good night from me, Steve Davis. Good night, Don.
The Adelaide Show podcast is produced by my dad, Steve Davis. If you want to start a podcast or get some help producing creative content, talk to him. Visit stevedavis.com.au. Thanks, AJ. I'm Caitlin Davis, and I agree with everything my sister said. But there's one more thing to say. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a rating or a review, because that will make my dad really happy. Oh, and one more thing. If you really, really liked it, please help a friend put the Adelaide Show on their phone. Thanks for listening. Buzz, buzz, I want to be.
Adelaide, 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 ooh, Adelaide, 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 ooh.